Hello everyone, and it is still morning my time, so I'm going to say good morning. It may be a different time where you are situated. I'm Robin Turner, and I'm both a presenter on this roundtable and also the facilitator of it. And so I just want to say a tiny bit about what it is, and then we will launch into introductions and then a bit of presentation, hopefully a broader conversation. And so this is a panel that is titled Black Women, Scholars and the Academy, Locations, Identities, and Transnational Research. And everyone that is part of the panel is a Black woman, and also at least part of the research and scholarship that they do is transnational. And there's a lot of discussion around positionality and reflexivity, but there's also sometimes inadequate attention to the ways in which our institutional locations shape what we do, and then also, of course, to the immense diversity within the category Black woman, right? And so I'm just going to read a bit from our abstract as a frame, and then we'll shift into introduction. Scholarship often is viewed as if it exists independently of the scholar who produced it. Yet people's social and institutional locations, their embodiments, and their identities affect their scholarship and their career trajectories both within and beyond political science. The funding and other resources available for scholarship differ widely across tenure-line faculty at research-intensive universities and community colleges, between adjunct instructors and university staff, and for independent scholars. Caregiving responsibilities may limit the time people can devote to scholarship or the research strategies that they employ. Researchers' gender and racialization affects the reception of their scholarship and its citation or erasure. And so that was sort of our initial frame. And then we went on saying a little bit about who we were and this real interest in having a conversation. And so I want to ask my co-presenters to introduce themselves. And let's go in alphabetical order by first name, which would mean Akasemi is first.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Robin, for asking me to be on this panel with these distinguished scholars. Tiffany, I'm so glad to meet you, Yolande as well. I am a comparative political scientist, and my current position is Associate Director at the Institute of European Studies at UC Berkeley. My research is really at the intersection of comparative political economy, comparative race and ethnicity, and the politics of immigration in Europe. I have a book project based on my dissertation, which I'm pitching to university presses, which looks at the conditions shaping European labor unions' responses to immigrants' political claims. I assemble evidence for an argument that basically states that immigrants' racial and ethnic identities are critical for their ability to get support from their unions and for their ability to mobilize successfully. In addition to that book project, looking at labor, race, and ethnic identity and immigrants in their mobilization, I also have an article manuscript that's under review called Egalitarianism and Exclusion that looks at the dark side of Scandinavian social democracy, something regularly celebrated in the news for managing to marry economic efficiency and social justice. And I offer an explanation about the current inegalitarian experiences of immigrants and racialized others as one rooted in the historical legacies of colonialism and slavery. While an associate director, I've also just developed a second research agenda tied strongly to the Institute and its partnerships on the EU in crisis. And from that, I had an edited book come out in January of this year, Palgrave Handbook on EU Crises. And then I have some journal special issues in various levels of production, looking at issues of the global commons and also issues of transatlantic relations between the EU and the US. In terms of my, is that enough, Robin, or can I talk a little bit about my positionality and as well?
So if you could just say, I think you gave us our title, but just sort of locate that in terms of where it
Okay.
fits within the academy, and then just say something about your caregiving.
Okay. So as associate director of a research institute at Berkeley, I am not on the tenure track. My position is renewable every 2 years based really on kind of, the evaluation of my director, my faculty director of the institute, who is a tenured professor. That said, as I can see from several other research institutes at Berkeley, people generally are able to stay on in this position as long as they would like, provided they have funding for their position, whether that's raised through grants or endowments, and provided that they have a good working relationship with the faculty director that approves them for renewal. I do not do teaching. If I wanted to do teaching, that would impact my salary. So it's actually very tricky to do teaching. What else can I say about it? Well, there are many things I do enjoy about my job, but one of them is the tension between administrative tasks and forging your own research identity. That also is very much dependent upon whether your faculty director values you as a scholar and supports you in that. And it's also how successful you are in linking your research profile to funding for the institute, institutional funding. So in some ways, I would say I have been able to kind of shape and carve the position to continue and even expand my own interest in research. I haven't really been successful in gaining more teaching experience, which I'm interested in doing. I have learned quite a bit about administration and what it takes to lead an organization. So I'm, very grateful to have had that. But there are several tensions that arise, also being that in a university, really the top dogs, for lack of a better expression, are the tenure track faculty. And so sensing that kind of real status and how that impacts the way faculty interact with me and my counterparts at other research institutes on campus is something I'm always kind of mindful of. And at times I do see, as a roadblock when I'm trying to get something done. I should also mention I have 2 children, and with the pandemic, it has been quite challenging to, Zoom school at home and kind of keep things going and sort of also support my staff with just the various challenges of the pandemic. And then, of course, racist violence that's been in the news all the time. Not that it really ever went away in our lifetimes, but certainly seemed much more prominent as everyone was at home and had nothing to do, or, was kind of overwhelmed by the information about that. And coupling that with, being in a field that is very white and, having the time to kind of look at my own trajectory, look at my own experiences, my own educational trajectory, which has only been in PWIs, kind of having different moments to kind of reassess, what is my role in sort of perpetuating white supremacy as I am doing all this work on European studies, even though it is critical and broadening, has been really challenging at times. So I'll leave it at that because I don't want to take up too much time, and happy to keep discussing with everyone.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Dr. Tiffany Caesar. I am an African centered independent researcher, public scholar, holistic healer, writer, and fifth grade English teacher at Johnston Hopkins Elementary in New Iberia, Louisiana. My background is in African American and African studies, gender studies, as well as African studies. My research includes South African women and political exile, mothering Black women, WOMXN, and the politics of self care, Africana women in educational leadership, womanism, and Pan Africanism. I am a cultural heritage ambassador at the Nelson Mandela Museum in Umtata, South Africa, and the Hush House Museum in Detroit, Michigan. I created an online series called Black Meditations with Dr. Caesar on Facebook that shares stories of national and international change agents, Black change agents, using their work to heal and build the Black community. The latest episodes are on Black women and self care, with the upcoming episode titled A Pan African Approach to Surviving Systems. I am a sister, teacher mother to 50 predominantly African American children who affectionately call me Miss Dr. Caesar. I am a loud, you can't tell me what to do daughter, constantly challenging my Southern father patriarchal ways with love. And that's a brief intro. If there's anything else you would like me to expand on, please let me know.
Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Yolande Boutka. I am an assistant professor at Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario, but I live right outside of Toronto. I've been in this position for a little less than 2 years. Prior to that, I was a visiting professor at GW and I had a postdoc at University of Denver. And prior to that, I was actually in policy. I left academia shortly after my PhD to pursue policy work in the field of security, peace and security in Africa. So I lived in Nairobi, Kenya for a few years with my family. My research is at the intersection of comparative politics and international relations. I have 3 projects, and I'm just going to give you the themes. The first project is transitional justice in Rwanda and looking at the carceral state in Rwanda. That was my dissertation work, and I worked with released prisoners of the genocide. The second project is a historical and political analysis of women's contributions to liberation movements in Southern Africa, focusing on Namibia and hopefully in Angola if I can get the funding. And my last project is on the microdynamics of protests in 4 different sites in Sub-Saharan Africa. In terms of care responsibility, I am the mother of 3 children, ages 10, 8, and 6. With the pandemic, the Canadian system, or at least in Ontario, we were out of school for a year ago, all the way to September. They went back to school, but after Christmas, they could no longer go back to school for a long period of time. I'm also a daughter of someone with a medical condition, living away. So part of the beginning of the pandemic necessitated me to literally work out with my parents every morning via FaceTime to keep them healthy, keep them busy, but also to keep them indoors until that became a habit that they could pick up on their own. And I'm a sister and I'm a member of the community. So I have caregiving responsibilities, but I also have a lot of people who are taking care of me. And for that, I'm very grateful. Thank you.
So thank you. I will now introduce myself in the same way. My name is Robin Turner, and in terms of my sort of institutional position, I'm an associate professor of political science at Butler University, which is a master's comprehensive teaching focused institution that's private in Indianapolis. And And I'm also chairing our department right now and directing the Peace and Conflict Studies program and doing other service. In terms of my research focuses principally on how public policies shape rural political economies, influence identities, and affect people's behavior in Southern Africa. And really, I'm interested in marginalized people and places, and that has been mostly in what are state recognized traditional communities, as well as in some freehold tenure areas where people were dispossessed and displaced, as occurred across Southern Africa, but where there's no formal recognition of communities in those places. And so I worked on politics surrounding nature and tourism and property, on, again, politics of identity. And I'm doing work now on women's involvement in traditional leadership in South Africa. And so, in terms of my caregiving responsibilities and roles, I am a daughter and a sister, but I don't, and an aunt, but none of those people live within 500 miles of me. And which has meant that during the pandemic, I've only been able to see my mother and brother and sister-in-law and twin nibblings once. And my brother has principal responsibility for caretaking, when my stepmother is doing most of the caregiving for my father, who's quite elderly. I look after a dog and my partner, but that does mean when we think about the pandemic, I haven't had to Zoom school or do things like that, right? And so this was really just meant to sort of give you a little bit of a sense of who we are and what our present positions are, but I do want to shift over to a bit of an invitation for the Roundtable participants to reflect and to trace a bit of the journey, right? And that may be personal, it may be institutional, it may be scholarly, to where you are now. And some of you have touched on some aspects of this in your introductory comments, but I would invite you to take another 5 to 7 minutes to talk about whatever aspects are most salient for you at this moment. And whomever would like to start this part next is welcome to do so.
I can start. Remembering the body in scholarship, not just the text or the research, but the person and or vehicle producing. My body needs rest, time, rejuvenation, or as my scholar sister friend, Dr. Malonis would say, radical self-care and slow work, referencing her latest work, Hey Mama, Dear Sister, Sister Love, Black women's healing and radical self-care through epistolary work. We have to do the slow work of self-care that allows us to truly produce at the level beyond publication. We Black women researchers desire the transcendental space where our souls smile at the work we produce, because it really matters and contributes towards some type of change, even if it's just for ourselves. This slow work is antithetical to neoliberal rhetoric that we work until we drop or preoccupy what Walker calls Black women entrenched in oppressive isms, the mules of the world. We carry everyone's weight with no avail to ourselves. My work seeks to highlight transnational Black women in politics, creating African-centered institutions, ACIs, and my work hopes to reveal their vulnerability and struggle of trying to do it all while taking care of self, the self that at times has been stretched thin. My current scholarship mirrors the work of the women I study, specifically in my last two publications, one on Phyllis Dendala, a political exile from South Africa, who lived in Detroit, Michigan for almost 10 years as an anti-apartheid and civil rights activist writer, and McKinney Tumaini, who repatriated to Cameroon and created several African-centered schools in Africa to help decolonize the curriculum and contribute to the African Renaissance. In the creation of books and institutions for the liberation of Black people, I am reminded through their story of the slow work they had to do in order to manifest these jewels for the Black world. I am also reminded and waiting patiently for Dr. Jewel Doe's book on ambition and Black women in politics, because I would dare to add that my research subjects, mothers, mentors, and muse as well, are in fact actively engaging in self-care by pursuing their political ambitions. Both educators, both cross-continental women, African women, both mothers mothering beyond their own circumference to nurture Black radical movements. I wrote both articles in very difficult times in my life where I struggled financially, emotionally, spiritually, and physically. And yet the common thread were Black women who covered and or encouraged me to pursue when my words were the only things that satiated my hunger. I began writing Africana Women Leaders of African-Centered Education, a portraiture of mothering, Pan-Africanism, and nation building in Africa, focused on McKinney Tumaini in 2017 when I was conducting data in South Africa as a graduate student. My advisor at the time, Dr. Rita Kiki Ndozi, reached out to me and offered me an opportunity to submit the chapter in the upcoming anthology, New Frontiers in the Study of the Global African Diaspora Between Uncharted Themes and Alternative Representations, later published in 2018. I started writing my next article, Phyllis Dendala Revisited, The Politics of Mothering Black Resistance Movements Through Writing, after I came back from my data collection in South Africa 2018. It took me 3 years to finish due to constant transitions and obstacles. It was Dr. Tiffany Willoughby Harrod who opened the gatekeeper, for me to enter a safe writing space of Black women. That's where I workshopped the piece to completion, published in December 2020 in the International Journal of African Renaissance Studies, Multi, Inter, and Transdisciplinarity. Finishing the last article was a task in itself because I was and am teaching fifth graders, and yet the ancestors granted me access to the transcendental space where my soul smiles at my work that I produce, because it really matters and contributes towards some type of change, even if it's just for me. And I will stop there.
So thank you. Again, I'm going to open the floor to our presenters to see if you're called to go next.
You go ahead.
That's usually how it goes, yeah. So in terms of my journey, first of all, I think I would say I never thought that I'd be where I am, for a variety of reasons. First, because my parents wanted me to be a doctor. My parents are from Togo, West Africa, and my father was, didn't really care what I did, but he wanted it to be something great. But my mother was very convinced that I should be a doctor, a medical doctor. And I spent most of my youth studying chemistry, physics, biology in order for me to qualify to enter pre-med in Quebec, what we call preparatory school between secondary school and university, called Cégep. And I am French speaking, and so that's what I did. And but I really just loved reading. I loved reading and writing fiction and poems And there are various critical junctures in my life as a youth, but also as a young adult, that have kind of shaped my trajectory. If I had done what I really wanted to do, which was writing, I would have kept writing probably through my studies. But unfortunately, at one point in, I think it was my senior year in high school, I was accused of plagiarism. Of I wrote a story. I was very excited about my story. I wrote it, rewrote it, redrafted it for weeks, and you had to read it in front of the class. And I wanted to be a bit extra. I memorized my story. Back in the 1990s, I created a soundtrack to my story, recorded animals and wind and timed myself. And I was very excited about the story. I had props. I made a tombstone because the monologue was over the tombstone of the loved one. And when I finished my performance, I was accused of plagiarism. The person said that she had shared my story with a journalist in Quebec, who had said that somebody like me could not have possibly written this piece. And that my parent intervened, obviously, because they had the multiple drafts of the story and so forth. But that pushed me away from writing, and I stopped writing, and I just focused on chemistry and science until I decided that that's not what I wanted to do. Took a year off, and then went to work, and then went back into political science, international relations, because I had a passion for that as well. But somewhere early on in my academic career, I was told that I was a terrible writer and that I would never make progress or any type of accomplishment in academia. So some of these traumatic experiences definitely shaped my trajectory and the types of decisions that I made very early on in my academic career. I never thought I'd be an academic, also because my dad was an academic, at least for a short period of time. He got a PhD. And the reason why we came to Canada in the 1980s was because he had a postdoc in Quebec City. But his postdoc project was stolen by his advisors. It was at the height of the nationalist movement in Quebec. Black people were not welcomed, and they did get away with stealing his project. He moved away from the city, and we moved in a very rural area where racism in the academy pushed him away. So for me, academia was always perceived, or knowledge production or writing was always a site of violence. So when I eventually finished with my PhD, where I really stumbled into the master's and stumbled into the PhD, the objective was always to go to policy, to do the real thing and not deal with people who think that they're producing knowledge better than anybody else. And as I ventured in my work in Kenya, I had the opportunity to work with the African Union, the East African community, with activists who are dealing with issues of peace and conflict, with politicians, with people in the security sector. But every time I kept asking for, long-term questions, the longue durée approaches to how we got to where we are, I was always told, no, there's an emergency. We have to, solve the crisis here and crisis there. And this is one of the reasons why I went back to academia. But I always committed myself to maintaining the types of skills that would allow me to escape academia if I felt like it. Because I've always, even if as I'm back into this field of work, I always navigate the space as if tomorrow will be my last day. And I need to have an escape pod. And the escape pod is my continued relationship with the policy world, with activists. As a Black woman, as a young Black woman, even when I lived in Africa and operated in sectors of peace and security, I was always told, what are you doing there, little girl? This is big men business, not young girl business. I've been asked to fetch coffee and asked to fetch tea multiple times in these spaces, and always having to hold my own. And part of my trajectory at the moment is not just the type of work that I'm doing, but also my commitment to engaging and encouraging young women, particularly young Black women, to carve their space on their own terms, and making sure that they know that that space is there as well, but they should not feel a commitment to staying in a field that is violent to them. When it's time to go, it's time to go. So I feel free. It's emancipating for me to know that I can do what I need to do with the ethics that I find to be very important in terms of citation politics, in terms of engaging activist work in my scholarship, in terms of asking difficult questions about the erasure of Black and African women in the scholarship that I do, but not feeling like I have to cower because I may not get tenure. If I don't, I can move on to do something else, and I can do that confidently.
So thank you. I know, Akasemi, you and Yolande were sort of going back and forth about who would be next. So I'll invite you to speak next.
Well, let me say I'm so honored to just hear your experiences, Tiffany and Yolande, and a lot of what you say really resonates with me, although I have also had some very different experiences. I think I'll start by just saying a teeny bit about how I got interested in studying European politics. My first job after college was working in corporate communications for Deutsche Telekom, which owns T-Mobile USA, the T-Mobile, the cell phone company. And one thing that really struck me in the 2 years that I was working there was how incredibly different it was from my friends who were doing internships in nonprofits and publishing in New York City. So I had healthcare, I had dental, I had a free apartment, I had subsidized transportation, and I just thought, wow, this is incredible. That is not what it was a paid internship, I should mention. That's not what a lot of my friends were experiencing. And I wanted to know why. And I also wanted to know if I was having a unique experience because I went to an Ivy League university and I was an American. And so that was something I was aware of as soon as I started working in Germany, was my positionality in that being American was somehow seen as positive in Europe, and even a Black American, and that I felt American more in Europe than I'd ever really felt in the United States. But at the same time, recognizing that, could it be that good for kind of Muslim immigrants who are living in Germany, Turkish immigrants, other Black people who live there and who may or may not have a migration background or heritage. And so I really wanted to understand if they were having this experience. And this led me to do a master's in political science at UNC Chapel Hill, where I explored these questions of kind of empowerment among immigrants and racialized others in Germany. And this also led me to do a PhD. Now, I should say that, there's very much a reputation, I think, in comparative politics that the people who are looking at questions of welfare provision are super progressive, and that a lot of the literature really is about upholding Scandinavia. Like, how is it that other countries in Europe, basically countries among the advanced industrialized countries, which basically means kind of former settler societies and Europe, why are they so generous in doing universal health care and taking care of moms and providing all these payments for its citizens, and the US is this outlier? Well, Scandinavia should be the model. So there's really this ethos and kind of reputation of it being very progressive. And perhaps naively, I held on in one hand to this idea that I would be able to not only do research examining whether these societies were truly as just when it came to immigrants. Not only would I be able to do that research, but that I would belong and that I would be included. And I can say that my trajectory from the beginning, when I first came to Germany and worked till now, has really been one with just like jolting dissonance of realizing, oh my goodness, this is so racist. And, having to kind of hold on to, well, I could still contribute. I could still do something, I can still connect with people who care about the empowerment of racialized others, and push forward. Because if I had ever kind of settled in that fact of how closed my subdiscipline is, I would have just given up. And so that, I think, really combines sort of institutional, scholarly, personal challenge that I faced, because it manifested itself in so many ways. I mean, the first being that when I was in college, I think Columbia was 8, 9, 10% African American. And I thought I would at least see that percent everywhere I went. And what I've experienced is that it's shrinking the whole time. I have to do so much work, which I'm glad to do, but to find the other Black people, find the other scholars of color. And that has been so, it's joyful when I am able to do, when I do find them, and also allies who value kind of decolonization and addressing racism at every level of the academy, not just research, topic. But it is also daunting to realize that it's getting harder, the further I go in my career. And I did not think, I'm fortunate and grateful and humbled and empowered to be leading a research institute, but it is not what I set out to do. I set out to be a tenure track professor at a, for lack of a better word, highly ranked PWI. That's what I set out to do. And I did not land there. And again, as I could say, for example, I remember I took a course where we were looking at, Marx, Polanyi, Adam Smith. And I remember bringing up, well, what about slavery? Didn't that matter? What about colonialism and development? It's just being shut down right away. And I've had so many experiences like that where I sort of thought, okay, well, I guess I'm not reading it wrong. I guess I'm reading it wrong. But then it would always come back. And, I had that in my dissertation and my book manuscript. So I've found a way to kind of, address sort of critical substantive issues in integrating racism into our understanding of European politics that are not mainstream at all, but have had the constant experience of being told that that's not the story. What are you doing? Oh, interesting, but odd. And then realize that, not only pursuing that work, but that doing it in this body, that perhaps I'm not legibly seen as, possessing the knowledge that I do possess, or I'm not actually credited with the CV that I do have, or, I speak German, I've studied Danish, but that I started to think that I've had 8 interviews over 6 years and never been hired for a tenure track job. And I've started to think that maybe I'm like some kind of, circus freak when people, I'm trotted out and people are just like, wow, she can speak, but this has not been something this is something that over time I've started to, just grapple with in terms of how am I moving through the academy, and, what can I get done, and, how different my experience is from basically your typical white male who I believe, if they were looking at labor and immigrants, would probably have had a very different outcome. And indeed, my friends who are white and Asian have said, I can't believe you're not doing this. I didn't prepare a job talk. You did it 3 times, I didn't have any publications. It doesn't seem to matter that you get more than more. So I just want to end with, I think I'm so glad that I got to meet Robin. Full disclosure, we went to grad school together, and she was such a role model to me and friends. And, I've been fortunate to find people like that, but also my current role, topics and approaches that my subfield marginalized. Because my role is interdisciplinary, I've been able to meet and indeed put forward scholars of color, Black scholars who are taking these critical perspectives in other fields. So history, English, comparative literature, geography. And I just feel so fortunate because I think in retrospect, if I had you know, landed in a tenure track position, I would have been so isolated in the field of comparative political economy, where basically no one looking at these questions. You know, I would only in, I guess, African American studies or comparative literature or ethnic studies are people even grappling with these. So I'll just stop there, but that was what I wanted to share.
Thank you. I'm going to talk, and if one of you can like flag me if I need to wrap up or if I'm talking for a really long time or something. And then after that, I want to just open it up so that we can have an actual conversation that includes everyone who is present. But I guess I will say to start that a lot of what people have said resonates with my own experience, but then also in thinking some about what Yolande said in terms of parental expectations. Both of my parents are first generation, and in terms of college and university. And my mom got a master's, my dad did part of one, and they experienced the sort of class mobility thing where you become like a middle class Black person in the US, but you don't actually have that much wealth and stuff. And that shaped their expectations for me and for my siblings and for many of my cousins, in that the desire, I think, for us was to pursue a recognizable profession that was meant to produce something stable, right? And so for me, because I was okay with math and science and stuff, I was initially pushed towards engineering and computer science and things like that. My dad kept trying to get me to take a marketing course or to go do corporate things. And it's just like, okay, there's a real dissonance here, right? Because they want stability, but then also, in addition to the schooling that I was sort of having in K-12, I was getting some exposure to some of the stuff that Tiffany is talking about, like talked about early on, in terms of the sort of Africana perspectives, education around things that are not included, around slavery, around colonialism, around African histories that are far more expansive and interesting than what would be presented, you know, when you just hear there was Egypt and there was slavery. And also these same things on the US. And it's like, well, okay, if you're telling me this stuff about the world and the past and about how the US is really structurally violent in all sorts of ways, and then saying, go do a standard corporate job, this doesn't actually work, right? And so when I went to university, I started out engineering and public policy. Public policy was always interesting. Engineering was real boring. And so eventually I left, and I was fortunate in that in public policy, I had some professors that were interested in histories of activism and radicalism and sort of things beyond your sort of standard public policy curriculum. And so that sort of work led me into doing some nonprofit work in the southeastern US, which was really interesting, but also it was clear to me that the philanthropic space was funky. And thinking about what Akasemi was saying, the conditions of existence for doing nonprofit work that isn't the mainstream nonprofit work are also not very good. And I think it was a year or two after I finished undergrad that Lisa Sullivan passed away, who had started the Black Student Leadership Network, had been a protege of Miriam Wright Edelman, who started the Children's Defense Fund. And so it became real clear to me how people who are super valued, who are doing impactful work that is really making a difference for people, can easily be just sort of led to early death, right? Because of the mule, because of the expectation that we will look after everyone else. And so then that made me want to always make sure that I actually had the ability to live at minimum and live in a way that was interesting and worked for me. And I got the opportunity to go study abroad and live in South Africa, in Cape Town, which is an interesting, weird place. But while I was there, a South African born, basically American academic suggested pursuing a PhD. And that seemed like it might be a way to do work I was interested in without being in the corporate space or in the international development space. And so then I ended up doing that, going to Cal, which is where I met Akasemi, which is good for comparative. I am a comparativist, but also really funky and conservative in odd ways and really anti-Black. And then I had the good fortune of when I was doing, when I went on the job market, and I was fortunate I landed the first time to come into a department that, although it has many of its own challenges, had another Black woman, Terry Gitt, who's right here, who hired me. And it meant that for some things I wasn't alone, right? And I think that probably accounts for part of why I've stayed in the academy instead of going somewhere else. So I am going to stop talking and just really invite people to join in and share as they wish. But yeah, I think there are a lot of common themes. And everyone can see each other, so you can just unmute yourself if you have a thing to say. So.
I hope Terry and Caroline know that they are welcome to join us as well, yeah?
Well, I just want to say listening to you all has just been both inspiring and also some aspects are sad, because I just think of what amazing gifts you all have and how brilliant you are, and the losses that have been suffered in so many ways inside the academy and out. And every time I think that the world is finally paying attention to Black women, other things erupt. But it's always evident to me that, we have the answers from our struggles, and just the lenses that we use. I'm also intrigued by the multiple things that we do successfully. Just listening to you all the different, just all the different things that you do. And thinking about some of the things that I do also at the same time. It's like, how do we do it? But then again, we do suffer in the struggles. So that's kind of what I'll say for now. But I feel very fortunate to have Robin in the same department as me. It has made a world of difference, because I was at the university 10 years before she came, and that was very challenging. So just having an additional person plus additional Black woman and in the same department is huge. And it's just made things a lot easier. Not perfect, but a lot easier. And it's also assuming a leadership role too, which has made me completely happy. So I'll stop there.
I wanted to say that I really came here to hear Dr. Caesar and Boutka, and I feel horrible that I didn't get to hear it, but I will watch it when Gladys posts it. And so you might get weird emails from me telling you that I've just seen it at odd hours, because that's usually when I watch my videos. I don't sleep much because I'm actually going through insaneness where I'm at. I'm at Canada's most left university, and it is the most fucked up place I've ever been in my life. And when I just heard Terry, Dr. Jet, I just heard you speak.
Yes, Terry.
Um, um, Part of the reason why I was late today was because the only other Black woman who's tenured, Kamala Kempadu, I gave her a shout out for mentoring me through my hell at York. And then our listserv in my department blew up, basically attacking us, questioning um, why one, basically being uncomfortable with me wanting to recognize her as my leader, as my sort of mentor, and questioning and critiquing it. And they couldn't see past it. And what was incredible is the racial patriarchy that Kamala Kempadu has always been talking about, that is very vile in it. And we feel pretty oppressed as especially diasporic Black women at the university. There are lots of international Black folk coming in, but we've had to grow up in the Canadian environment, and it has been horrific to us. And I think some people don't quite get it. So there is a racial patriarchy that is really vile. Anyways, it's been my life there for 9 years. But sometimes you have to legal up for people to actually respect you. And so I know I give part of my paycheck every every month to one of the best lawyers in Canada because I can't deal with the insanity anymore. It's just ridiculous. And I'm tenured, and I've been tenured for 5 fucking years, and it's just, oh my God, this is being taped and everyone's going to hear me swear. But yeah, it's just been enough, and I just can't take it anymore. It's painful. And I swear too much. Sorry, everyone. Sorry.
I want to apologize. Akasemi, did you raise your hand? I don't know if Tiffany also wants to say something.
Well, I just wanted to know what everyone's views on, encouraging Black students to pursue PhDs, students of color, women of color, because that's something I find myself really struggling with. There's a alt-ac literature that really seems to be, written primarily by white women, white scholars about it's so much better, you need to leave, it's toxic. And I think, on the one hand, it is very toxic, and is especially toxic when you have multiple identities. But I am so committed putting my own personal trajectory completely to the side. I am so committed to seeing more Black people in the academy doing this important work. It is truly my passion and at my heart that, for example, in my field, that people are looking at this. Like, colonialism should be a big deal. It was a big deal. It is still impacting us to this minute. And we need scholars of color to do that work, and they should have the freedom to do it. But when they cannot get hired, how can I tell them to go through the arduous process that it is of getting a PhD when it's up to these departments who will vote, and people will smile in your face and they will not hire you? They will not hire you because what you're saying makes them uncomfortable. And so I'm struggling with this. In some ways I come to a compromise because I know that fellowships, we give 30 plus fellowships a year. I can advertise for that. I can, write grants addressing specifically these issues. So even if students don't go into the academy, let them at least be well paid while they're studying. Let these students of color be well paid and not worrying about their financial difficulties. So I can put that energy into that. But it's just a real challenge for me. And the other thing related to that is, I had to tell some of my friends, I just can't, please stop emailing me and texting me because, I cannot read these texts where it's like, oh, we're just hiring 3 white guys in our department. And, we offered to this one Black woman, but she's not going to come, talking about it like it's her fault that she's not coming, and I'm just like, you know what? I can't deal with these emails and texts about, perpetuating this racial inequality. And I can't deal with it. I can't deal with it anymore. So it's kind of a lot I'm saying there, but yes, supporting students to actually pursue this work, and also dealing with people who think they're allies and yet are perpetuating it by talking to you about it's just moving on. People getting hired are not, they're not racial minorities, they're not women of color, but they're just moving forward with it and telling you that. How do you deal with that?
I would like to respond to that. But I would like to first kind of, I guess, address some of the things that you all said, and just kind of co-sign before I give my the perspective of that question. Do we encourage, Black students to get a PhD? I wanted to kind of say that I agree with you. Um, when you discussed earlier this idea of landing and having challenges landing in traditional roles. And I also feel the same in my own background because I have an interdisciplinary background. I look at African-centered education, I look at gender, I look at politics, I look at culture, cultural heritage, and finding that it's really hard to package me, and or I'm used for a project and then thrown away. And so that goes back to what Yolande was talking about, carving out a space in multiple areas so that, if that space no longer needs you, right, that you have another space to go to. Even in grad school, when I was working in cultural heritage, I'm helping, the university get like grants and things based on my own ideals. When they got more money, somehow I was, wrote out on those particular resources, right? And so I would describe myself as a trailblazer in these particular spaces. They will use me for my ideals when it comes to diversity and creating dialogue and creating, programs surrounding Black women, diversity, and things of that nature. But once it's over, it's like, okay, we have your information, we have the basis of it, and now we are ready to remove you from the space, right? Versus nurturing you and taking that person with the project. And then also just feeling the same as Robin is being a first generational college student, but in the sense that I'm first generational as I am the first person in my immediate family to get a degree, then get a master's, and then get a PhD. So in that sense of my family, when they went to college, they got the traditional nurse, teaching. And so even when I got my BA in English, I was like, I'm not teaching, but I am teaching. I always find myself in teaching roles. But being a first generational Black college student and navigating those space, and then trying to explain to your family, like, hey, I'm getting an interdisciplinary study in African studies, and them not understanding, like, what can you practically do with that? So going to the question of what Akasemi is asking concerning, PhD in political science, PhD in the social science spaces in which we all know that are traumatizing, right? Traumatizing within the programming, traumatizing even after, as you are looking to be in a position that will care, truly care for your work, whether it's, looking at different aspects of immigrants in Europe, or South African schools and transnationalism and Pan-Africanism, struggling with this idea of, do my research matter? And I say, yet and still, there was somebody bold, usually a Black woman, a Black scholar, a scholar outside of the margins of the traditional white male gaze to say, yes, you can and you can. And so I think as long as we as scholars are incorporating this particular ideal of honesty and not painting this picture of, I guess, roses and dandies and sweet peppermints, then we should encourage them with a realistic outlook that you're going to have to hustle, like Yolande said, and make sure you have spaces, that you have your foot in different spaces.
It's kind of interesting as I'm listening to Tiffany talk, and this is also what I experienced when I was out of academia. You have these ideas, and it's particularly worse when you're in what academic talks like precarious positions in the academy. So not fully in, or having a foot in and a foot out, either because you're contingent faculty or you're an independent scholar. The ability that people have to kind of steal your intellectual property, right? And this is something that I encounter a lot, not always myself, though it's happened to me even very recently, but to scholars in the global South, scholars who are based in Africa, who collaborate with scholars, particularly white scholars in North America and Europe, and say, we need you to gather the data. We like your concept. We'd like to develop it into a project, but institutionally, the links and the accountability goes between these actual established scholars and their institutions. And in terms of even like who owns the data, right? Once it's collected and once, there's IRB process and when it's published, who is allowed to, I've had instances where I've brought people onto projects and working with, non-BIPOC scholars and, wanting them to leave the scholars out of academic publications. Like, oh, but they're not scholars. They don't need the publication. We can put them on the report, but we don't need to put them in a journal. And even the conversation, like the blog, the conversation refuses to publish people who don't have official university affiliations, right? So when I've co-authored with activists, they approach me for publications, like to write up a blog about our research. They say, well, we can put your name as the author and we can footnote your activist collaborator. And I said, and multiple times the conversation has done that. 3 times they've approached us for about the same research, and 3 times we've told them, unless our collaborator can be an author who's contributed to the intellectual framing of our research, to the analysis, then we will not publish there. But even, when I think about Akasemi talking about the institutions, like the structures that perpetuate these types of power imbalances, even when people are not deliberately trying to exclude you on their project, the structures will work in a way that people who decide not to stay in the academy, or people who have a foot in and a foot out, are vulnerable. Their intellectual property can at any time be taken away from them if they don't have the community of people who surround them, which leads me to say my last thing. I encourage Black people to enter the academy, not because I want them to suffer like me, but because it was suffering in many instances, but because I think that maybe we've developed better ways to build community amongst ourselves. To I was never told, hey, when you're doing a PhD, you should get a grant, even though you got full funding, because that could be good for other things. This type of guidance and this type of protection, the type of sponsor, not just mentors, sponsors, at least like the thing that I've seen recently is Black scholars, particularly Black women scholars, and we can talk about the gender dimension of that as well later, have taken it upon themselves, to their sometimes detriment of their health, the sponsorship of emerging Black scholars, and that gives me hope.
So we have only, I think, 3 minutes left.
I think Jamie wants to say something.
If I could just say something real quick first, I'm sorry that I'm late. I'm trying to work this interface out. But I am a student still. This is my 3rd year. I'm at Clark Atlanta University in political science. Just for the short time that I've been here, you all have shared so many gems and so many perspectives that I never thought about. And this is something that hasn't been mentioned to us. I don't think it's out of ill will. I think it's just, I don't know what it is, but it just gives me something, to think about a little bit more because I want to be able to be a practitioner and in the academy. I think that's what makes our work really great, is being able to do both. But I never thought about the grant thing that you just mentioned. Some of these things that I don't even know about. So I'm very thankful that you all are this transparent with us. And Dr. Shanaz, am I saying your name right? Dr. Shanaz.
Just call me Caroline. Yeah.
Okay. I'm old school, so I'm gonna call you Miss Caroline. Miss Caroline, I feel your frustration with the cursing because I feel the same way sometimes about things too. But I really appreciate you all being as transparent as possible in this space because it gives us a lot. It's two of my other cohort members are in here too, and it just gives us like more, to think about and different perspectives. I think we've been spoiled too because we're at a HBCU. And so we don't always have to navigate the spaces of white people and like whiteness all the time. But they're, when we leave the institution, these are things that we should be cognizant of and aware of. And I'll be honest, like listening to you all, it's like almost like a slap in the face because again, like we haven't thought about these things. So I really appreciate it. And that's all I have.
Well, thank you. And thank you for sharing your perspective. I just want to say a couple things as we wrap up. One, I want to sort of co-sign the yes, bring people in, but be real honest with them about what they're confronting. If you can find ways to fund them, like Akasemi is talking, if you come out without debt or without significant debt, you have a hell of a lot of different options, right? Or if you develop an escape strategy like Yolande has. And I'd also say, thinking about this, there are spaces outside of political science, and political science is one of the most hostile spaces for thinking about things like addressing colonialism, right? Like people are doing that work, but getting a political science department to hire someone in political economy for comparative political economy that's thinking about slavery or colonialism, that's a harder task, right? But really the hope with this roundtable was to sort of open up a conversation, and I think we have done that. And I also think there's more happening with people. I mean, people have always, I think Black women tend to be community builders, or there's a lot of us who are. But I think there's been more intentional mentorship, sponsorship, creation of spaces that's been happening. And so hopefully this is just sort of one step in that. So, and I will note, for those of you who are not aware, I think most of you do know, but Nadia Brown and India Lanier created the Sister Scholars Network, which meets once a month, actually this afternoon.
Sorry, I don't know what's this, please?
So this is a virtual Zoom thing. It's about a year going on, but it's for BIPOC non-males. And so women, non-binary, trans, but just not a white man. And it's a sort of space to come together and share knowledge, experiences, and I think it can be sustaining. I, of course, am involved in creating the Transnational Network of Black Women Scholars of African Politics, but I think there are other sort of things that are out there. So I would say look out for those spaces, and maybe we can create some sort of series of things for the next ENCOAST. So, does one of you have the link that's done this before? Okay, Yolande, if you can drop it in. And also Tiffany, I don't know if you have a link. You talked about the wellness work that you are doing, where you have another one dropping really soon, or just did, if you can put that link. in the chat before we wrap, that would be lovely. So, but thank you all.